Welcome to the Explainer. So imagine having the exact same argument for 400 years. Sounds exhausting, right? Well, today we're unpacking a fascinating piece of source material called the Second Argument. It claims that a very specific debate about gender and authority has basically been trapped on this endless historical loop. Let's get right into it. The author asks us to imagine a locked room. It's a metaphor you might relate to if you've ever felt like you're talking to a brick wall. On one side of the table sits a woman, armed with meticulous preparation, deep study, and flawless logic. On the other side sits a man, referred to as the interlocutor, who is eternally polite, endlessly reasonable, and equipped with a profound certainty in his own default authority. The text's core thesis is that she completely wins the argument logically, but he just smiles, dismisses her, and the loop begins all over again. The source traces this exact dynamic across 4 distinct eras. It argues that as we jump from 1690s New Spain to 1790s London, over to 1940s Paris, and finally landing in modern-day Silicon Valley, the specific vocabulary of the debate completely changes. But, and this is the absolute crux of the author's claim here, the structural dismissal of women remains exactly the same. The justification just adapts to fit whatever framework of knowledge is dominant at the time.
Part 1, 1690, the Divine Syllogism.
We begin in 1690s New Spain, where the text introduces Sor Juana Inés Cruz, a truly brilliant scholar. Her bishop attempts to shut down her study of theology, and the source's glossary actually defines his behavior as the bishopric of certainty. The text highlights how this bishop uses politeness and this paternal concern for her soul to quietly shut down her intellect. He basically tells her that a woman's mind is a delicate vessel, framing his structural suppression not as malice, but as protective care.
And the text argues that Sor Juana uses absolutely flawless theological logic against him. She cites the parable of the talents, right? But he just cites her fragile nature. He doesn't actually engage with the argument. Instead, he uses his institutional power to end it, simply dismissing her as merely clever.
Moving on to Part 2, 1792, Reason versus Nature.
Jumping forward to London in 1792, the source introduces Mary Wollstonecraft facing off against an interlocutor known as the statesman. Now, the dominant framework is no longer theology, it's reason. As the text points out, Mary argues that women's minds are chained by a systemic lack of education, but the statesman, he claims they are just naturally governed only by the heart and sensibility.
The author points out a pretty profound irony woven into this 18th century debate. Men of this era passionately demanded political revolution for themselves, yet they vehemently defended domestic tyranny for women. Wollstonecraft's argument perfectly encapsulates how the system manufactures the very weakness it then uses as an excuse for subjugation. She famously writes, "You have caged us, and then you marvel that we do not soar."
Part 3, 1949, the universal myth.
So the vocabulary of dismissal shifts again, this time to existential philosophy in 1949 Paris. Here, Simone de Beauvoir debates a male colleague about her upcoming work, The Second Sex. The author defines his stance as the myths of the universal. Think of it this way. Male philosophers imagined a default, sexless human condition, while the text argues that women were trapped by structural limitations. To him, male experience was universal, the default, but female experience? That was just considered a niche limitation.
When de Beauvoir points out that men have made themselves the default subject and women the other, how do you think her colleague reacts? Well, exactly like the bishop and the statesman. The text shows him dismissing her structural analysis as mere sociology, or just a personal grievance. He completely refuses to see that his supposedly objective philosophy is actually built on a foundation of male privilege disguised as reason.
Part 4, 2024, the meritocracy myth.
Bringing this historical loop all the way to modern-day Silicon Valley, the text introduces Dr. Sarah Okonkwo confronting her tech CEO. The really crucial point here is how this modern interlocutor uses buzzwords like data and culture fit. The text actually calls this the data defense. It's the practice of using seemingly neutral metrics that, in reality, just reward those who conform to a narrow, pre-existing cultural template. The source material draws a direct line from the bishop's 1690 divine order straight to the tech executive's 2024 biological data. When Sarah points out that criteria like culture fit systematically exclude certain groups, the CEO just falls back on debunked ideas of biological aptitude to claim the industry is a pure meritocracy. The vocabulary is completely modern, but the dismissal? It's ancient.
Part 5. Resistance and the Infrastructure.
So, if this argument is just an unwinnable loop, why keep making it? To understand that, the text summarizes its core thesis. The vocabulary evolves from theology to natural law to existentialism to data. But the underlying certainty that men are the default authority never actually shifts. According to the text, the interlocutor literally cannot accept the argument because doing so requires dismantling his entire worldview.
The text argues that breaking this loop requires confronting what feminist philosophy calls epistemic injustice. This is the harm done when your lived experience is discounted simply because of who you are. It's something you might have actually felt firsthand in a meeting, where your expertise was entirely ignored just because of your background. Naming the structural problem is the first crucial step here, even if the immediate audience just flat out refuses to listen.
According to the author, the argument isn't actually made to convince the man sitting across the table. It's to document the truth, it's to build a vocabulary. They wrote it down so the next generation would know they weren't alone. It's about creating a robust intellectual infrastructure and forging solidarity across centuries.
I want to leave you with the ultimate paradox posed by the text. If the man across the table is destined to just, adjust his collar, smile, and walk away, what is the true nature of winning?
The author concludes that structural change is a slow, grinding inheritance. These women fought for continuity. Passing down the argument and building that infrastructure of resistance is in itself a profoundly meaningful victory. So, as we look to the future, the text leaves us wondering, how will the vocabulary of dismissal evolve next, and are we building the infrastructure to meet it?